It's terrible that after 50 years it is behind closed doors. And I've no intention that I've started to just stop now. I'm determined to put an end to this. Terrible.
For 50 years, the palace had operated behind closed doors, and Queen Isabel believed that chapter of secrecy was finally over. She had spent decades fighting her way from outsider to consort, and on the morning the letter arrived, she believed she had won. What she did not know was that a single sealed instruction, written years earlier by the late Prince Albrecht, was about to undo everything she thought she had secured. Before we go further into what this actually means for the royal house of Aldenmark, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how this story unfolds. Isabel did not flinch when her private secretary began reading from the folder inside Ashworth House. She had walked into the room that morning expecting good news, final confirmation that her permanent apartments at Draymore Castle had been approved after months of renovation planning. Instead, she heard that a decree written by Prince Albrecht, sealed before his death and held in trust by the Crown Estate's legal office, had just been formally activated. The decree stripped her of residential rights across every principal Crown property. No permanent apartments, no independent household authority, no control over staff assignments inside any residence held by the Crown rather than owned personally by the King. A Crown residence, her secretary reminded her, was property held for the institution's official use, not a private home the King could simply hand to whomever he chose. That single distinction turned what might have looked like a family slight into something closer to an institutional ruling, one that could not be undone by affection or apology alone. The secretary's voice caught partway through the second paragraph. Isabel lifted her eyes and told him, evenly, to continue. Every clause repeated the same restriction in different language. She could visit the residences. She could attend ceremonies inside them. She could stay temporarily when duty required her presence. But she could never claim a residence as her own, never appoint permanent staff within it, and never make decisions about how its private wings were used or renovated. She had spent years working her way to the center of royal life, weathering public skepticism, learning the rhythms of an institution that had never fully welcomed her. And now, in the final pages of a document written by a man who had died believing buildings could safeguard the future, an invisible boundary had been drawn around the very places that had come to symbolize her acceptance. King Edmund watched his wife's composure crack into something closer to disbelief. He reached for the papers, hoping to slow the moment before it turned into something neither of them could walk back. She pulled them toward herself instead. Then came the question he had been dreading. How long had his father been planning this? Edmund didn't answer right away. His hesitation mattered because the decree had been constructed specifically to separate Crown property from anything the King personally owned, meaning he could not simply cancel it with a private command. Undoing it would mean formally challenging his father's conditions in front of the Crown Estate's trustees, the body responsible for safeguarding long-term royal assets and settled agreements. It was not a decision he could make alone, and it was not one he could make quickly. Isabel turned to the final page and found, beneath the formal legal language, a short handwritten note in Albrecht's own hand. No future royal marriage, it read, would automatically grant control over residences reserved for the sovereign, the direct line of succession, or the ceremonial life of the Crown. The wording was careful. It was not written in anger. Somehow that made it colder. Then the secretary noticed something else, a break in the page numbering. A second sealed document was missing from the file. Access to it, he explained, had been restricted to exactly 3 people: King Edmund, Princess Regina, and Prince Henry. Isabel stared at the empty space where that page should have been and demanded it be produced immediately. Before anyone could answer, the door opened. Princess Regina walked in without knocking, set a black archival case on the table, and kept one hand resting on its lid. Isabel told her flatly that the decree would be overturned. Regina didn't argue the point. She only said that their father had expected her to say exactly that, and had prepared for it. But before Isabel could mount any kind of challenge, she would first have to sit across from the 3 people whose futures Albrecht had quietly protected, in a decree written at her expense. The document itself was framed in the dry language of property law, inheritance, and institutional continuity. But its real damage was entirely human. For Isabel, it read like one final rejection from a man whose approval she had never fully earned in life. For Edmund, it reopened an old and unhealed tension between personal loyalty and public duty. For Henry and Regina, it created an impossible position: either defend their late father's final wishes or shield the dignity of the reigning king's wife, and there seemed to be no way to do both cleanly. Isabel kept her eyes fixed on the archival case while Regina stood beside it, saying nothing. The shock of the first page had already taken her certainty from her. The sight of the people now gathered around the table only deepened the wound. Her titles still carried weight: ceremony, public visibility, a formal place in the life of the nation. But the decree had drawn a hard line just behind the palace doors. She could represent the crown inside its grandest houses without ever holding real, lasting authority over the rooms where the institution's future would actually be decided. That distinction mattered more than it might have seemed, because royal influence was never measured only in titles and appearances. It was measured in access, in who held the keys, who controlled the household staff, and who could walk into a room without needing anyone's permission first. Edmund waited until the others had stepped back before speaking to his wife alone. She asked him quietly whether he had always known his father distrusted her. He didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he straightened the papers on the table and admitted that Albrecht had believed, right up to the end, that buildings and legal structures could protect a future that people alone could not be trusted to protect. Crown property, he reminded her again, meant residences held for the institution itself, not personal family homes a sovereign could simply give away out of love. That principle forced him to confront a division he had spent years trying to smooth over in his own mind. His marriage belonged to him. The palaces, in a very real sense, belonged to something larger than either of them. Isabel heard the explanation. She did not hear the comfort he had hoped it would offer. She reminded him of everything she had endured standing beside him. The years of public scrutiny, the constant sense of having to prove her loyalty over and over, long after she believed that phase of her life was behind her. Now, after finally reaching his side on the throne, she was being told her place within these walls remained, in the end, temporary. She asked him whether love had ever actually carried any real weight inside this institution. Edmund didn't have an answer strong enough to fill the silence that followed. Henry felt his father's pain plainly, but he did not move to soften the decree. He remembered a conversation once recorded in a private household account, in which his grandfather had warned him that temporary emotion should never be allowed to reshape permanent inheritance. Henry understood how cruel the moment felt from where Isabel was sitting. He also understood, in a way he found difficult to explain aloud, why the order existed at all. If one marriage could unilaterally alter protected residential rights, then every future succession risked becoming a private power struggle rather than a stable transition. Regina opened the archival case and revealed the first hidden condition inside it. Albrecht had named her the decree's primary guardian, the person entrusted with enforcing its terms after he was no longer there to do it himself. A guardian, in this context, meant exactly that: the one responsible for making sure affection, pressure, or private bargaining couldn't quietly wear the document down over time. She told Isabel plainly that the role was never meant to be a privilege. It was a burden she had accepted well before their father's death, understanding fully what it might one day require of her. Then Henry's name appeared beneath hers in the document. His signature, it turned out, would be required before Isabel could ever be granted even a single permanent private suite inside any principal crown residence. Edmund looked at his son and understood, in that instant, that Henry hadn't simply been informed of this decision after the fact. He had been built directly into its enforcement mechanism. Isabel turned to the supporting schedule attached to the decree, searching for some inconsistency, some weakness she could use. Instead, she found Princess Charlotte's name listed across several of the protected residential clauses. The pattern was impossible to miss. Albrecht's decree hadn't simply been written to keep one woman at arm's length. It had been carefully designed to secure another woman's future before anyone could ever challenge it. To understand why Charlotte sat at the center of the document, it helps to go back to a single evening at Draymore, a private dinner years earlier, and a disagreement that exposed a fear Albrecht could no longer set aside. What everyone else in the room dismissed at the time as an ordinary family tension, Albrecht came to see as something closer to a warning about the institution's future. From that night forward, he stopped viewing Isabel simply as Edmund's partner. He began to see her growing influence as something closer to a constitutional risk, not because of any single action, but because of what unchecked influence inside the household could eventually mean for the people meant to inherit it. By then, Albrecht had already spent months quietly studying how royal apartments, private offices, guest wings, and household authority would need to be reassigned once the reign changed hands. A succession planning meeting, in the language of the household, was simply a private discussion about how duties, homes, and staff would transfer from one monarch's household to the next. To Albrecht, these were never minor domestic details. Crown residences functioned as working institutions in their own right, and whoever controlled their private spaces could shape access to the sovereign, reward loyalty among staff, or quietly undercut the standing of future heirs, all without ever raising a public objection. The tension finally broke during a private dinner at Dremore, held not long after one of those planning sessions. Isabel challenged a proposal that would have reserved a major family apartment specifically for Henry, Charlotte, and their children. She argued that decisions of that kind belonged to the next sovereign's household, to be settled later, once Edmund had actually taken the throne. She called the reservation premature, describing the protected rooms as territory being claimed before the new reign had even properly begun. Albrecht set down his glass and asked her, quietly, whether she considered the direct heirs to be guests inside their own inheritance. His restraint made the question land harder, not softer. Isabel answered that Edmund had already sacrificed enough over the years, and shouldn't have to begin his reign surrounded by conditions imposed by the previous generation. She insisted the future king deserved the freedom to build his own household without old restrictions trailing him from room to room. Charlotte said nothing through any of it, but her silence carried its own weight. She shifted her chair slightly away from the table after hearing the apartment described as unclaimed territory. Albrecht noticed. He also saw Henry glance toward his wife before lowering his eyes, unwilling to turn a family dinner into an open confrontation between his father's future and his own family's security. That small, quiet movement was enough to convince Albrecht the dispute was no longer really about rooms at all. It was about whether the next generation's place in the institution could be made to depend on someone else's approval. Later that night, Albrecht summoned a trusted secretary and dictated the first clause of what would become the sealed decree. No consort outside the direct line of succession, he ordered, could displace, diminish, or place conditions upon the residential standing of an heir. A consort, the note clarified, was the spouse of a reigning monarch, significant in ceremony, but never part of the line that actually inherited the crown. Then came the conversation that changed everything. In a private exchange, later documented in household records, Albrecht asked Edmund directly whether he would protect Henry's household if Isabel ever pushed for greater control over it. Edmund answered that once he became king, he could not let old family anxieties dictate the terms of his marriage. Albrecht heard something colder underneath that answer than his son intended. Before dawn the next morning, he expanded the restriction from a single apartment at Dremore to every principal crown residence in the kingdom. Years later, those same words returned to Dremore, this time with Isabel sitting across from the very guardians empowered to enforce them. The confrontation had always felt inevitable. Nobody expected it to feel quite this personal. Behind a closed door at Dremore, Isabel faced Regina and Henry with the decree spread out on the table between them like a verdict already handed down. There were no aides in the room, no private secretaries, no carefully rehearsed statements. Just 4 chairs, one in signed response, and years of unresolved tension finally coming to the surface. Isabel pushed the document away and accused them of using a dead man's authority to humiliate her. The room went still around the accusation. This meeting, everyone understood, would decide whether Isabel accepted restricted guest status inside the crown residences, or chose to formally challenge the decree through the Royal Household Property Council, the body responsible for resolving disputes involving royal buildings, apartments, and official household use. The stakes were real, because a formal challenge wouldn't stay private for long. It could force Edmund to publicly defend his wife against his own father's final wishes, exposing a fracture at the very center of the monarchy for the whole country to watch. Isabel turned to Henry first. She told him that refusing to grant an exception would punish Edmund more than it punished her, leaving the king to watch his own wife treated like a visitor inside the homes of his own reign. Henry held her gaze and chose his words with visible care. His father's pain, he said, could not be allowed to become permission to dismantle protections built for future generations. The answer was calm, but it landed hard. He wasn't rejecting her out of anger. He was choosing deliberately to place inheritance above emotion. Regina stayed silent until Isabel claimed that Albrecht had never understood the modern monarchy. Then the princess moved her chair slightly closer and said that their father had understood it well enough to predict exactly who would be sitting in that room, exactly what arguments they would make, and exactly what pressure Edmund would eventually face. Her voice never rose. That restraint made the warning land harder than any raised voice could have. Isabel demanded the missing second page. Regina opened the archival case and produced the sealed sheet, preserved among Albrecht's private papers. The first hidden clause was blunt. Any attempt to pressure the king into overriding the decree would automatically trigger even stronger restrictions. In plain terms, the harder she pushed Edmund to intervene, the less freedom she would ultimately retain. The second clause cut deeper still. Isabel could not direct renovations, approve household appointments, or decide room allocations inside any of the 4 principal crown residences without written consent. Those were the exact powers that shaped daily influence inside royal life, meaning the decree didn't only limit where she could live, it limited how much authority she could ever build behind the palace doors. Voices finally rose. Isabel accused them of turning their father's fear into a punishment aimed squarely at her. Henry answered that the order existed precisely because that fear had once been ignored. Regina closed the case and told her plainly that nothing on those pages had been added after Albrecht's death. Then Edmund walked in, having heard enough of the argument through the door. He didn't move immediately toward his wife. Instead, he looked at his son and asked whether Albrecht had left behind any personal message explaining why the restriction had to be so absolute. That message, once found, would reveal that the real power behind the decree never rested with Albrecht alone. It rested with the future of the crown itself. Isabel had expected an old family document that could be softened through affection, negotiation, or royal authority. What she found instead was something far more carefully built. Albrecht had constructed a chain of guardians, legal conditions, and succession protection specifically designed to survive personal pressure, even from a reigning monarch. The hardest truth of all wasn't that Edmund lacked the power to rescue her. It was that Albrecht had deliberately placed that power in the hands of Regina, Henry, and eventually Charlotte. Edmund took the personal message into a smaller room and read it alone. It wasn't a legal command, but its weight felt like a final judgment all the same. Behind it stood the Crown Estate's residential framework, household approval procedures, and private undertakings signed well before Albrecht's death. In simple terms, those arrangements controlled who could live, work, and hold authority inside official royal properties, and no single person could unilaterally reverse them. Only a collective agreement among the guardians could break that chain. Edmund read the message twice. Then he set it down without speaking. Albrecht had written that his son's devotion to Isabel might, in certain moments, cloud his judgment on matters touching the succession, especially when private loyalty collided with permanent inheritance. That accusation wounded Edmund deeply, because it struck at the one choice he had spent years defending, the belief that love and duty could coexist. His father's final words suggested the two could never fully be trusted together. Regina watched her brother's expression change, and for a moment her own anger softened. She told him the decree had never been written to destroy his marriage. It had been written to keep one reign from quietly weakening the next. She represented continuity and enforcement. Henry represented the interests of the future sovereign, the rights and responsibilities that came with someday inheriting the throne. Together, their approval ensured that present-day emotion could never permanently diminish the position of the next king's household. Edmund looked toward his son, and Henry did not retreat. He understood, that his signature had become something more than a family formality. It had become a shield placed around Charlotte and their children. If he surrendered it now, simply to ease his father's pain, every future protection built into the decree could later be dismissed as negotiable the moment pressure became personal enough. Then Regina unfolded the final page of Albrecht's message. Through the same documented household account, the late Duke had declared that Charlotte must never be made to depend on a previous consort for access to the homes, where she might one day serve beside the sovereign. Isabel's name wasn't written anywhere in that sentence. It didn't need to be. The next revelation was even more decisive. A dormant succession schedule granted Charlotte immediate residential priority at Draymoor and Ashworth Palace once Henry assumed expanded constitutional duties. A succession schedule, in household terms, was simply a prepared plan that activated automatically once an heir took on greater official responsibility. Once triggered, it would secure apartments, staff access, and household space regardless of what the reigning consort might prefer. Isabel understood the silence in the room before anyone explained it to her directly. Albrecht hadn't simply blocked her from these residences. He had built Charlotte's future well beyond her reach, years in advance. Edmund returned to the table knowing that a public fight would force him to choose openly between his wife's status and his son's protected inheritance. This time, there was no room left to delay. The first consequence of the king's decision didn't arrive in a courtroom. It arrived quietly at the door of Isabel's apartments at Draymoor, a ring of keys set down on a polished table. No announcement was made. No public statement accompanied it. And yet for Isabel, that quiet surrender carried more weight than any formal demotion could have. The rooms once prepared for her would never become her permanent household. Her staff would be reassigned. Her private renovation plans would stop, and every future stay would require prior approval. She hadn't lost her title. She had lost the certainty of belonging. Edmund had made his decision before the keys ever arrived. He would not challenge the decree. A public battle over crown residences risked making it look as though his marriage mattered more to him than the stability of the succession itself, and that risk, in his judgment, was simply too great. Crown residences existed for the institution's continuity, not as property to be distributed through personal affection. By stepping back, Edmund protected the crown. In doing so, he left his wife exposed to a public verdict he could not fully control. News of the decree spread quickly, and public reactions split along familiar lines. Some commentators framed it as Albrecht's final act of foresight, a safeguard against instability at the top of an institution built to outlast any single marriage. Others called it needlessly cold, a punishment dressed up in the formal language of property law. Isabel read the early coverage alone before allowing any official response to leave the palace. She drafted one line defending her years of service and warning against unfair conclusions, then removed it. In its place, she added a simple pledge to respect the arrangements protecting future generations. A small change, but one that quietly reflected the private truth Charlotte had already offered her behind closed doors. Public attention began to soften somewhat when Isabel and Charlotte appeared together at a scheduled royal engagement not long after. Neither woman said anything publicly about the decree. Their shared appearance said enough on its own. The family had chosen visible unity over open conflict. In the end, Isabel did not overturn Albrecht's decree. She never reclaimed permanent apartments at Draymoor, never gained control over rooms at Ashworth Palace, and never forced Henry or Regina to surrender the authority their father had placed in their hands. The loss was real, and it was permanent, but the true meaning of the whole ordeal wasn't found in what she lost. It was found in what she chose to do afterward, whether to let the rejection define her, or to accept that serving the crown sometimes meant giving up privileges she had once believed were owed to her. Isabel came to understand that the restrictions weren't going anywhere. She could still stay inside the crown residences for official duties, ceremonies, and family occasions, but she would never hold a permanent claim to private apartments or independent household authority within them. A crown residence, she finally accepted, was an official property preserved for the institution's work and its succession, not a personal home shaped by affection alone. What had once felt like rejection, she began to understand as the boundary Albrecht had built to protect continuity long after he was gone. Edmund established their principal private home on a property he owned personally, entirely separate from Crown Holdings. There, their marriage wouldn't depend on guardians, succession schedules, or written approval from the next generation.